Good morning, everyone. It is Pastor Monica McDougal here of Attica First United Methodist Church, and it is a joy to be with you all this morning, Sunday, May 26th. I'm sorry there wasn't a sermon video last week. We had issues with the audio when the video uploaded, so I had to post a written transcript instead of a video, but hopefully today we won't have any problems. But this morning's sermon was inspired by a passage from Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. And this morning I will read that passage from the New International Version, or the NIV. But please join me as we prepare our hearts and minds for the reading of the word as we hear these words from the prophet Isaiah. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. The word of God for the people of God. Praise be to God. So I think if I were to take a poll and ask every single one of you watching this to list different famous works of art, I don't think it would take long before someone mentioned the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel, of course, is located in Vatican City. It is famous for its breathtaking painted ceiling completed by Renaissance artist Michelangelo. Beloved by many to this day, the Sistine Chapel receives close to 6 million visitors every year. It is a work of art that has become synonymous with Michelangelo himself. When you think of Michelangelo, you think of the Sistine Chapel. It is undoubtedly his most famous work. Therefore, it might be surprising to learn that Michelangelo actually never wanted to paint the Sistine Chapel. In fact, he attempted to turn down the commission on multiple occasions. The Sistine Chapel was built under the direction of Pope Sixtus VI between 1477 and 1483. During that time, a team of Renaissance artists worked on painting the inside of the chapel. It wasn't until 25 years and 5 popes later that Michelangelo began his work on the ceiling. At that point, he was commissioned by Pope Julius II, who wasn't exactly known for being the most accommodating of popes. In fact, his nicknames during his papacy included the Warrior Pope and the Fearsome Pope, among others. The original ceiling had suffered damage and it needed repaired. And once those repairs were finished, Pope Julius II summoned Michelangelo, who he had met while Michelangelo worked on sculpting his tomb, and he ordered him to accept the commission. But Michelangelo never wanted to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. While he was trained in painting, he wasn't known for working in that medium. He was first and foremost a sculptor known for such statues as La Pieta and the statue of David. He was also daunted by the difficulty of what he was being asked to do, because as you might imagine, painting an entire ceiling of the Sistine Chapel would take him many years and require tremendous labor, even if he had help. It would also force him to spend a long time away from his home in Florence, and it would keep him from being able to work on other projects. So Michelangelo made it quite clear to Pope Julius II from the beginning that he did not want to do this and that he resented being asked to. But he had no choice to accept it, because what the Pope wants, the Pope gets. Michelangelo was convinced that he was going to fail at this task. He wasn't confident in his painting skills, and he didn't trust the Pope's intentions. In fact, he was really worried that the Pope and his artistic rivals were conspiring together to try to make him look like a fool, that they wanted to see him fail. So he spent much of his time working on the ceiling, being completely frustrated and resentful of the task. However, despite these frustrations, Michelangelo stuck with it. And he was motivated to see the project through by a few factors. The first was that he knew that being the artist associated with this great work would be a tremendous honor. Even though he didn't know just how beloved the Sistine Chapel would become, he clearly had some inkling that he was being part of something bigger than himself. Second, he wanted to succeed. He wanted to do well. Call it pride or call it passion, Michelangelo wanted to prove his doubters wrong, including himself. But lastly, he believed in the overarching sacred vision of what he was being asked to do. Michelangelo's work was heavily influenced by his Christian faith. He believed that art should be used to glorify God and to inspire piety in those who viewed it. He knew that the scenes he was painting on the ceiling of this chapel weren't just any pictures, but they were chapters in a story, the story of God. Being one of the storytellers who got to help tell that story to new people wasn't just an honor to Michelangelo, but a calling. So despite his reluctance, his doubts, his fears, Michelangelo said yes to the Sistine Chapel. And Michelangelo's story reminds me of a lot of the various call stories we have in Scripture. You know, the ones where God calls someone into a new role or a new mission. Today we heard the prophet Isaiah's call story, and Isaiah, like Michelangelo, has reluctance, doubt, and fear to overcome in order to answer his call. In truth, that's pretty common with most of the people God calls. Jonah, Moses, Esther, Peter, and more, all prophets who reluctantly accepted God's call. Isaiah's story is particularly interesting as it comes a full 6 chapters into the book of Isaiah. The first 5 chapters are quite intense. They outline the plight of the kingdom of Judah, and it is a dark, dark plight. Isaiah has already been working in the temple in Jerusalem as a prophet, and now remember, prophets in the Old Testament weren't considered fortune tellers who predicted the future. Rather, they were religious and political advisors who estimated potential consequences. They warned of what could happen. And in the opening 5 chapters of the book of Isaiah, we see that Isaiah is going to great lengths to try to warn King Uzziah of the consequences of Judah's actions. He warns the king that his actions and those of the nation as a whole had caused them all to fall far from the glory of God. Judah is corrupt and sinful. They are mistreating their most vulnerable people and then bringing meaningless sacrifices to the temple in hopes of making up for it. But God sees through these actions and these worthless sacrifices, and he demands the people to change their wicked ways. He calls on them to seek justice, to care for the oppressed, to nurture the orphan, and to advocate for the widowed. Isaiah warns the king that if Judah continues to prioritize their own wants and desires over God's wants and desires, then it will be far too easy for their enemies to conquer them. But these pleas seem to fall on deaf ears as our passage from Isaiah 6 begins, revealing that King Uzziah has died, ushering in a reign of a new king, his son Jotham, who repeats the mistakes of his father. Now, while it may seem insignificant, the detail in our passage this morning that King Uzziah had passed, that fact that is mentioned at the very start is an extremely important detail for us to pay attention to. Judah has found itself at a time of transition, much like in the United States of America when one president leaves office and another one takes over. That is a very vulnerable and nervous time, right? One ruler has left, another takes their place. In this case, one ruler has died, his son will step in. Now, these moments of transitions are periods of high anxiety, but they are also moments of opportunity, times to hope and to dream for a new future. The problem is Judah is too dependent upon their earthly rulers, and those rulers have and will continue to fail them. Isaiah, however, finds himself immersed in a dream or a vision at this time, and this vision would prove to be pivotal in Isaiah's life. In this vision, he sees God, high and exalted, seated on a throne. This image of God is meant to be compared to the image of Judah's earthly kings, and we are meant to see God as a superior ruler. God will not die like King Uzziah did. God cannot be conquered or overthrown. The death of a monarch signals an end to an era, but God's era, God's reign, is eternal. Isaiah is overwhelmed at this moment. Who wouldn't be, right? To see God in front of you on a throne. It has been a tense and a scary time for Isaiah and for his people. What's more is that it doesn't seem to be getting any better as King Jotham takes the throne. Isaiah's prophecies seem unconvincing and ineffective, and now he's seeing a vision of God who is clearly there to bring him a life-altering message. So Isaiah responds the way most prophets do. He shrinks. He cries out to God, "Woe to me, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." In other words, Isaiah feels completely unworthy of this moment. He doesn't understand why God is addressing him in this vision, why God would show up to him of all people. Because when he looks at himself, all Isaiah sees are his own inadequacies, his mistakes, his failures. Sounds like Michelangelo a bit, doesn't it? When he was asked to paint the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo had every excuse in the book as to why he wasn't the right person for that job. "I'm not a good enough painter. It's too big of a job. It will take too much of my time. It will keep me away from home for too long. Surely there's anyone else who could do this over me." Isaiah feels similarly. As far as he's concerned, he is a failed prophet with dwindling influence, working for a kingdom that is doomed to collapse. But God doesn't care about his excuses. God is choosing him. One of the seraphs in Isaiah's vision plucks a coal from the altar and touches it to Isaiah's lips. This is a symbolic act. Fire was used to cleanse and disinfect. So the seraph using this burning coal to cleanse Isaiah is symbolic of cleansing and disinfecting him. It's an act of God's grace and forgiveness, something that Isaiah will be called to preach to his people, as their story will soon take an even darker turn as they move into a period of exile. The seraph declares to Isaiah that he has been cleansed, saying, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for." And then God speaks, but not to Isaiah. God speaks out loud to the seraphs, and he asks them a now famous question. He asks them, "Whom shall I send?" It occurred to me as I sat down and read this passage this week that God didn't need to ask a question here. God could have easily just turned to Isaiah and demanded him to go and answer this call. But instead, God asks out loud, seemingly to any and everyone, "Whom shall I send?" That's powerful to me because it means that unlike Michelangelo, who was forced to paint the Sistine Chapel by a brutal and unforgiving pope, Isaiah is given an opportunity to say yes to an opportunity, to volunteer. And he's given that opportunity by a merciful and gracious God. And so when confronted with this opportunity, Isaiah responds saying, "Here am I, send me." And so despite feeling completely inadequate and unworthy, Isaiah is able to say yes to God for 3 key reasons. Like Michelangelo, Isaiah understood that being offered this opportunity was a tremendous honor. God doesn't just call anyone to do anything, but God had Isaiah in mind for this calling in particular. And Isaiah knew it would allow him to be part of something bigger than himself. Second, if God sees that Isaiah is worthy, then who is Isaiah to disagree? Right? If God is looking at you and saying, "No, I think you can do this. I believe in you." Who are you to look at God and say, "No, you're wrong. I'm right, you're wrong." So Isaiah is determined to succeed. He wants to prove God right. He wants to prove that he himself is worthy, just like God thinks he is. And then finally, Isaiah wants to help tell the story of God. Michelangelo, of course, becomes a storyteller for God through painting breathtaking biblical scenes on the ceiling of one of the most famous and most visited buildings in the entire world. Isaiah, on the other hand, becomes a storyteller by bringing his people hope in the midst of hopelessness. And he does this in order to help them hold on to their story of faith in the midst of great suffering. Now, both Michelangelo and Isaiah prove to us that just because you say yes to something doesn't mean it's going to come easy. By the time he was done painting the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo was said to not only be at his wit's end, but he was also in terrible physical pain. Imagine the stress his body must have been under, spending years of his life on top of precarious scaffolding, bent towards the ceiling and painting intricate designs. His hands, his arms, his whole entire body ached. He had lost significant mobility by the end of this project. And as beautiful as his work ended up, it didn't happen without Michelangelo's literal blood, sweat, and tears being poured into it. Likewise, prophesying to Judah wasn't easy for Isaiah either. At times, he reminds me of Cassandra from Greek mythology. If you enjoy Greek mythology like I do, then you might know that Cassandra was a Trojan priestess who was cursed by the god Apollo to never have anyone believe her prophecies, even though they were always correct. She would warn people, but no one would take her seriously. Such is the life for many biblical prophets, including Isaiah. He would watch as Judah is conquered by Babylonia. He would be helpless as the temple is destroyed, as his people are forced from their homes. He would journey alongside them in exile. He would watch as they began to waver in faith, slowly losing their culture and their language and their identity while in captivity. Saying yes to God didn't mean Isaiah didn't have to work really, really hard to answer God's calling. But the end result was worth it because exile ended, the people returned, and while they still wrestled, as do we to this day, with sin and evil, they learned how to care for one another and how to find God in the midst of their struggles. They held on to their story of faith. Just like Isaiah, God is calling each and every one of us to do something too. Actually, you're called to do many things in your life. I truly believe that. And oftentimes we are very reluctant to say yes. It's easy to believe that we aren't good enough, that we aren't smart enough, that we aren't devout enough, or worthy enough to do whatever it is that God is asking us to do. It's easy to convince ourselves that we don't have the time or the skills or the resources or the energy to answer God. But God already knows what you know. In fact, God knows more than what you know. God knows your weaknesses and your strengths. God knows what you are capable of and what you cannot do. God knows where you will triumph and where you will fail. And yet God is still going to call you to do something. Now, what is God calling you to do? I don't have that answer. That is between you and God. But I promise you there is something. For me, God called me to go to seminary and to become a pastor. And there were and are many times in which I feel completely inadequate to fulfill that call. There are times where I doubt if I am the right person for this job. But at the end of the day, I have to hold on to the fact that God has placed me here. And that God has placed me here for a specific reason. So I have to learn how to trust in God's will over mine. Now, most of you are probably not going to be called to go to seminary and become a pastor like I did. Although if any of you figure out that that is what God is calling to do, I am thrilled to journey alongside you as you go through that process. But even though your calling looks different than mine or Isaiah's or Michelangelo's, you are still going to be called. Maybe God is going to call you to step into a new leadership role, to learn a new skill, to join a new community. Maybe God will call you to dive deeper into one aspect of your faith, or to ask questions, to seek answers, or to change your mind. Or maybe God is calling you to befriend your enemy, to get to know the stranger, or to simply ask someone for help. No matter what, God's calling is often scary and intimidating. It kind of has to be in some way because it's meant to transform you. And change is scary. But sometimes God needs us to change. None of us can afford to wait until we feel 100% confident because that is very rare. But what we can do is trust that God is 100% confident in us. Otherwise, God would not be calling you to do whatever it is God is calling you to do in this moment. God is asking each of us to step out into faith. But at the end of the day, like Isaiah, we are given the choice to say yes or to pretend like we didn't hear it. Although, in my experience, when you pretend like you're not hearing God, God is just going to talk louder, right? But we have the choice to say yes or no to God. But I hope that when you hear God speaking to you, that you won't let your fear or your self-doubt make you hesitate for too long. I hope that you will trust that God knows more about you and your abilities than even you know. That you will trust that God is using you to help tell a divine story, to help transform the world, or maybe even just to help transform yourself. Whether you are able to stand there and speak with confidence, or whether, more accurately, you respond to God with a voice trembling, I hope that whenever God calls you, that you will know that it is time to respond, "Here am I, send me." Amen.